Abbey Road Studios, Studio 2, August 1968. Ringo Starr sat behind his drum kit watching Paul McCartney demonstrate, for the third time, the exact pattern he wanted on Back in the USSR. Paul was not a drummer. He was explaining rhythm using his hands on his knees, counting out loud, stopping to clarify which beat carried the emphasis. Ringo nodded. He had understood the first time. He had understood before Paul started explaining. He hit the drums the way Paul wanted. Paul stopped him after 8 bars. "No, like this," Paul said, and demonstrated again with his hands. Ringo asked what was wrong with what he had just played. Paul said it was close, but not quite right. Ringo asked him to specify what was not right. Paul said, "The feel. It needs more energy." Ringo said he could add more energy. Paul said, "Maybe I should just play it." The room went quiet. John Lennon was in the corner with Yoko Ono, half paying attention. George Harrison sat on an amp with his guitar across his lap, looking at the floor. Jeff Emmerich, the engineer, adjusted levels and said nothing. George Martin, the producer, glanced at Ringo, then at Paul, waiting to see who would speak next. Ringo stood up from behind the kit. "Fine," he said. "You play it." He walked out of the studio, down the corridor, and left the building. He did not take his coat. He did not tell anyone where he was going. He got in his car and drove south. Paul recorded the drum part himself that night. Paul played the drums on Back in the USSR, Jeff Emmerich recalled in his memoir. He did it in a few takes. He was competent. Ringo would have been better, but Paul was good enough. Nobody said anything about Ringo leaving. We just kept working. John recorded his guitar part. George added his. By midnight, the track was mostly finished. Ringo had been gone for 6 hours. "I think we all assumed he'd be back the next day," George Martin said in a 1997 interview. "We'd had arguments before. People stormed out before. They always came back." Ringo did not come back the next day, or the day after that. On the third day, Paul called his house. Maureen, Ringo's wife, answered. She said Ringo was not available. Paul asked where he was. She said he had gone away. Paul asked when he would return. She said she did not know. "I got the sense she'd been told not to tell us," Paul said in Anthology. Or maybe she genuinely didn't know. Either way, Ringo was gone. The others continued recording. "We didn't stop," John Lennon said in his 1970 Rolling Stone interview. "We just carried on. Paul played drums on a couple more tracks. I think I played drums on one. We made it work, but it felt wrong. It felt like we'd broken something." George Harrison later said, "When Ringo left, I thought, good for him. I understood completely. He'd been putting up with a lot." Ringo Starr had joined the Beatles in August 1962, replacing Pete Best 2 weeks before the band's first recording session. He was 22 years old, already an experienced drummer, respected in Liverpool's music scene. "Ringo was the best drummer in Liverpool," Paul said in 1963. "Everyone knew it. When we got him, we knew we'd upgraded." George Martin was less enthusiastic initially. "I wanted a session drummer for the recordings," Martin said. "I thought Ringo was fine for live performances, but not precise enough for studio work. I was wrong. He turned out to be exactly what they needed. What they needed was someone steady, reliable, and uninterested in competing for attention." "Ringo was never trying to be the star," John said in 1968. "He just wanted to play drums and have a laugh. That was perfect for us because me and Paul were always fighting to be the star. Ringo let us fight," George added in a 1977 interview. "Ringo was the easiest person to be around. He never caused drama. He showed up, played brilliantly, and went home. He kept us balanced, but being the unproblematic one meant being taken for granted. I was always the lucky one, wasn't I?" Ringo said in a 1981 interview. "Lucky to be in the Beatles, lucky to be there at all, Never mind that I was a good drummer. Never mind that I worked hard. I was just lucky. The narrative had been established early by journalists who noted that Ringo was not an original member, that he replaced someone else, that he was the last to join. The press always made it sound like I was interchangeable, Ringo said in Anthology. Like any drummer could have done it. That hurt. Because it wasn't true. But after a while, you start to believe it yourself. By 1968, the internal dynamics had shifted. John was increasingly absent, mentally and physically consumed by his relationship with Yoko Ono. George was resentful about his subordinate position. Paul was trying to hold the band together by controlling every detail. Ringo was caught in the middle, attempting to maintain peace while feeling progressively more invisible. Nobody asked my opinion about anything, Ringo said in 1970. We'd be arranging a song and they'd discuss the guitar part, the bass part, the vocal. Nobody mentioned the drums. I'd just sit there waiting to be told what to do. During the White Album sessions, which began in May 1968, the working method had deteriorated. The four Beatles were rarely in the studio simultaneously. John would come in to record his songs with Yoko beside him, then leave. George would arrive to work on his tracks, usually late at night. Paul would be there constantly, working on everyone's material, offering suggestions, taking over when necessary. Paul was running the show, Jeff Emmerich said. The others resented it, but nobody else wanted to do it. Except Paul was so meticulous, so demanding, that it wore everyone down, including Ringo. Ringo's drumming style was intuitive and creative. He played for the song, not for himself, finding unusual patterns that served the melody rather than showing off technique. Ringo's fills were perfect, George Martin said. They were musical, not just rhythmic. He understood what each song needed. A Day in the Life, Rain, Strawberry Fields Forever. Those drum parts are as important as the melodies. That was Ringo's genius. But his style also made him vulnerable to criticism. Because he played simply, people assumed anyone could do it. If you play complex, people think you're talented, Ringo said. If you play simple, people think you're lucky. Paul's perfectionism during the White Album sessions extended to Ringo's playing in ways it had not before. Paul would stop takes because of the drums, Emmerich recalled. He'd say, "The timing's off," or "The feel's wrong." Ringo would redo it. Paul would stop it again. After the fifth or sixth time, you could see Ringo's face change. He'd stop asking what was wrong. He'd just play until Paul was satisfied. Chris Thomas, who assisted George Martin, said Ringo was being treated like a session player, not like a Beatle. Paul would say, "Try it this way," and demonstrate. Which is fine if you're producing a session musician, but Ringo wasn't a session musician. He was a Beatle, and Paul was treating him like he was replaceable. George Harrison noticed. "I could see what was happening to Ringo," George said in a 1996 interview. Paul was micromanaging him the same way he micromanaged me. But Ringo's a drummer. His whole identity was playing drums. If you tell a drummer he's not good enough, you're telling him he has no value. That's what Paul was doing, even if he didn't mean it that way. John noticed too, but did not intervene. "I was too wrapped up in my own thing with Yoko," John admitted in 1970. "Ringo was getting pushed around, and I didn't stand up for him. I should have, but I didn't." The breaking point came on August 22nd, during the back in the USSR's Sabirschurs. Session. Ringo had arrived early, set up his kit, and waited. Paul came in and immediately started explaining how the drums should sound. "He told me before I'd even played a note," Ringo said in 1981. "He'd already decided I wouldn't do it right. So when I did play it, and he stopped me and then said maybe he should play it himself, I just thought, what's the point? If you don't want me here, I'll leave." Ringo drove to Surrey where he kept a boat. He spent the night alone on the water. "I just sat there thinking," Ringo said in Anthology. "Thinking about whether I was good enough, whether they needed me, whether I needed them." The next day he called Maureen and told her he was quitting the Beatles. She asked if he was serious. He said he had never been more serious. She asked what he would do instead. He said he did not know yet, but he would figure it out. He spent 2 weeks away. He did not contact the other Beatles directly. "I thought if they wanted me back, they'd call," Ringo said. "And if they didn't call, then I'd know I was right to leave." Paul called after 3 days. Ringo refused to take the call. John called after a week. Ringo told Maureen to say he was unavailable. George called, and Ringo answered. George said, "I know how you feel," Ringo recalled. "He said he'd thought about quitting too. He said he missed me, not as a drummer, as a person. That meant a lot." During Ringo's absence, the remaining Beatles attempted to continue. Paul played drums on Dear Prudence and Martha, My Dear. John tried on The Ballad of John and Yoko months later. "We realized pretty quickly that we couldn't do it without Ringo," Paul said in 1984. "The drums sounded okay, but they weren't right. Ringo has a swing, a looseness that none of us could replicate. The songs felt stiff without him." George Martin said in 1992, "They could function without Ringo technically, but musically something was missing. The heartbeat was gone." On September 3rd, Ringo called Paul. "I said I was ready to talk," Ringo recalled. Paul said, "Please come back." I said, "On what terms?" Paul said, "Any terms you want." I said I wanted to be treated with respect. I wanted my drumming to be trusted. I wanted to be included in decisions. Paul agreed immediately. He said, "You're a Beatle. Of course you're included." Ringo returned to Abbey Road on September 4th. The studio was decorated with flowers. George Martin had arranged for dozens of bouquets to be placed around Ringo's drum kit. "When I walked in and saw the flowers, I almost cried," Ringo said. "It was the first time I felt like they actually valued me. Not as a drummer, as a member of the band." George Harrison said in Anthology, "We wanted Ringo to know we'd missed him, that we'd been wrong, that we needed him." John Lennon was more blunt in his 1970 interview. "We fucked up. We took him for granted. The flowers were Paul's idea, but we all agreed. We needed to show Ringo he mattered." The sessions continued, but the dynamic had shifted slightly. Paul was more careful with Ringo after he came back, Emmerich said. He'd still make suggestions, but he'd phrase them differently. He'd ask instead of tell. Ringo's confidence seemed shaken, though. He was quieter, more tentative. Chris Thomas recalled, "Ringo seemed like he was waiting to be criticized. You could see it in his body language. He'd play a take and immediately look at Paul to see if it was acceptable." It was sad. The White Album was completed in October. Ringo's contributions were as strong as ever, but his presence felt diminished. "You can hear it if you listen carefully," George Martin said. "The drums are great, but they're careful. Ringo's playing not to be criticized rather than playing to serve the song. That's the difference between confidence and fear." Ringo himself said in 1987, "I got through the rest of those sessions, but I wasn't the same. I'd lost something. Trust, maybe, or belief in myself. I don't know, but it never fully came back." The Get Back sessions in January 1969 were worse. The cold, the cameras, the tension between Paul and George, all of it created an environment where Ringo felt superfluous. "I just sat there most of the time," Ringo said, "playing when they told me to play, stopping when they told me to stop. I felt like furniture." When George quit temporarily, Ringo thought about quitting again. "But I'd already done that once," he said. "If I did it again, they might not want me back." Michael Lindsay Hogg, the director, noticed Ringo's discomfort. "Ringo was the observer," Lindsay Hogg said in a 2003 interview. "He watched John and Yoko in their bubble. He watched Paul trying to control everything. He watched George fighting for respect, and Ringo just sat there, keeping time, literally and metaphorically. He was holding them together by being steady, but nobody thanked him for it." Abbey Road, recorded in the summer of 1969, was Ringo's final album with the Beatles. He contributed Octopus's Garden, a song he had written during his time away in 1968. "I wrote it on the boat," Ringo explained in Anthology. The captain was describing how octopuses collect shiny objects and build gardens under the sea. "I thought, I'd like to be under the sea too, in an octopus's garden, away from everything." The song was straightforward and childlike. George helped him finish it. "George was very encouraging," Ringo said. "He never made me feel stupid for writing a simple song. He just helped me make it better." Paul was less enthusiastic. "Paul thought it was too simplistic," Ringo said in a 1976 interview. "He suggested changes to make it more sophisticated. I said I liked it the way it was. He said okay, but I could tell he thought it was a throwaway." The song was sequenced on side 2 between George's "I Want You, She's So Heavy" and John's "I Want You, She's So Heavy." It stood out as lighter, almost frivolous by comparison. "People always liked Octopus's Garden," Ringo said in 1998. "Kids especially. But critics dismissed it. They said it proved I wasn't a real songwriter, which hurt because I'd actually tried. But maybe they were right." When the Beatles ended in 1970, Ringo was the only one who expressed sadness publicly. "I miss the band," he told Melody Maker in March 1970. "I know it wasn't perfect, I know we had problems, but it was the best thing I'll ever be part of. I'm not ashamed to say that." John dismissed the sentiment in Rolling Stone. "Ringo's sentimental. He remembers the good bits and forgets the bad bits. I remember all of it. I don't miss any of it." Paul said in a 1971 Life interview, "Ringo's a lovely guy, but he doesn't understand why it had to end. He thinks if we'd just been nicer to each other, we could have kept going. It wasn't that simple." Ringo's solo career was commercially successful, but artistically uneven. He released 2 strong albums in the early 1970s, then struggled with alcoholism and creative direction. "I didn't know who I was without the Beatles," Ringo said in a 1984 interview. "I was Ringo the Beatle. When that ended, I was just Ringo, and I didn't know what that meant." He drank heavily throughout the late 1970s. "I was trying to fill the space the Beatles left," he said in 1998. "But you can't fill that space with alcohol. You can only numb it." He sobered up in 1988 and began touring with his all-star band. "I surrounded myself with musicians I respected," Ringo said. "People who wanted to play, not compete. We'd just get on stage and have fun. That's what I'd wanted the Beatles to be at the end. Just 4 people having fun." But it had stopped being fun long before it ended. In interviews decades later, Ringo consistently described himself as lucky. "I was the luckiest man alive," he said in 1995. "I got to be in the Beatles. How many people can say that?" Interviewers would note that he was also talented, that luck was not the only reason he succeeded. Ringo would smile and agree, but the language never changed. "I'm lucky," he would repeat. "That's the story, isn't it? Lucky Ringo." In 2015, during an interview for a documentary, Ringo was asked about quitting in 1968. He paused for a long time. "I quit because I thought they didn't need me," he said. "I came back because they said they did. But I never really believed it, not fully. I spent the rest of my time in the Beatles waiting to be told I wasn't needed again. And then, when the band ended, part of me thought, well, at least now I don't have to wait for them to figure out I'm not essential. They figured it out." The interviewer asked if he thought that was true. Ringo shrugged. "Doesn't matter what I think. Matters what happened. And what happened is the Beatles ended. And I'm still here, still playing drums, still lucky." Abbey Road Studios, Studio 2, August 1968. Ringo Starr sat behind his drum kit, watching Paul McCartney demonstrate for the 3rd time the exact pattern he wanted. Paul was not a drummer, He was explaining rhythm using his hands on his knees, counting out loud. Ringo nodded. He understood. He had always understood. He hit the drums the way Paul wanted. Paul stopped him after 8 bars. "No, like this," Paul said. Ringo stood up from behind the kit. "Fine," he said. "You play it." He walked out of the studio, down the corridor, and left the building. The drum kit remained, empty, waiting. Paul sat down behind it and began to play.